it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen.
Dead in Space. 500 Years of Galactic Exploration by Taxi Dancer. Terran Year 2588. Even as late as 2088, when the first interstellar Earthships reached out for the first time to colonize the endless, black, frigid horrors of space, the rustling, derelict carcasses of long-forgotten aircraft carriers, battleships, and submarines were still being unearthed from when they came to grief during the period of Earth's history known as World War II. Now, nearly 500 years after mankind's first cramped habitation units on Mars had evolved into domed, bustling megacities and spaceports, nearly 5 miles in radius, the rustling, derelict carcasses of long-forgotten starships now being encountered centuries after they first came to grief in the lonely, uncharted corners of space. The early days of interstellar travel were initiated by the one thing which had always motivated humans to strive towards the greatness of leaving their comfort zones: sheer greed and the promise of riches. Globalism had finally brought humanity out of the dark ages of believing in rugged self-reliance and individualism and into an enlightened new era of collectivism, where there was no more need for individual thought, free speech, or the belief in religion and worship of archaic, mythical gods. With Earth's resources rapidly being depleted in order to sustain an unsustainable population of dozens of billions, and with fully an eighth of the planet now uninhabitable because of pollution and waste, it was the international Globo corporations and the newly formed United Terran Government, the UTG, which ended up giving new life and new hope to humanity. Humanity had outgrown the 10 Commandments, the 10 subjugations which had been handed down by a god that never existed, and instead embraced 3 simple laws. 1. For the citizenry, give all for the government. For the government, give all for the corporations. 3. For the corporations, give some for the citizenry whom the government deems worthy. At one point in ancient human history, this might have been considered a dystopian concept, but history has been proven wrong before. Subservience to an all-powerful, all-caring, all-watchful elite 1% had not only sustained mankind for centuries, it allowed mankind to flourish. Humanity finally achieved that which the mythical gods had feared the most: unity of vision, unity of language, unity of focus, unity of will, loyalty to the corporations, and devotion bordering on worship to the one world government. The Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit had long been replaced with the Holy Human Trinity of corporations, government, and human citizenry, in that order. And with this enlightenment came the wisdom that the future was out there in space, where the horrors and dangers hidden in the boundless black void also held boundless resources, boundless opportunities, boundless breathing room away from a polluted, war-ravaged, and overcrowded planet, and, above all, boundless profit. After all, it was profit which made the world go round, and it was this quest for profit which led to the development of hyperdrive systems which, in turn, launched literally thousands of colonizer and explorer ships across the unforgiving cosmos in the first decades of interstellar exploration. Humanity had outgrown its home planet by a count of billions, and out of sheer necessity, billions of Earth's citizenry were piled into those first-generation starships, though admittedly not necessarily by choice, and launched into space. But eventually, after a few centuries of humanity overcoming challenges, hardships, and great sacrifices, humanity went on to spread its seed with colonies on the Moon, Mars, the moons of Jupiter, Alpha Centauri, Gamma Centauri, Delta Centauri, the Sirius system, and the mysterious Proxima and Ungulate systems. Outward, ever outward, had the hand of humanity stretched. In so doing, mankind had proven that mankind was its own god. If there was a real god, he had yet to show his displeasure as mankind reached towards the heavens to take his throne. Still, To be gods also meant that sacrifices of sons had to be made. Many of those first starships, which operated using first-generation hyperdrive systems, first-generation inertial propulsion systems, first-generation interstellar navigation systems, and first-generation life support systems, were never heard from again. So it was inevitable that mankind would eventually run into the forgotten relics of those who came before, who had made the ultimate sacrifice for the survival of the species. Jupiter Orbit, Terran Year 2184. It was a relatively random event which led to the discovery of one such vessel in Terran Year 2184. In fact, it was the first in a long line of derelict ships which mankind would stumble across in the subsequent decades and centuries. A long-range patrol vessel with a crew of 24 was in orbit around Jupiter on a mission to train crew members on how to operate the new orbital planetary survey equipment, which was now making its way into the fleet. On the second day of the mission, a test of the long-range scanners picked up an unusual anomaly, not on the surface of the planet, but rather on Ganymede, the largest of Jupiter's moons. The signal was extremely faint, one which could have easily been overlooked. The perceptive scanner operator recognized the feedback signal as a structure of some sort, which should not have been there. Ganymede had been scanned before, but those early-generation planetary scanners would have had little chance of picking up an anomaly that small on a moon that was nearly the size of Mars. After several diagnostic checks confirmed that the sensor arrays were running perfectly, the patrol ship's commander ordered a change of mission and set course for the giant moon. Once in orbit around Ganymede, it took another 8 hours to reacquire the anomaly again. Since they were on a training mission, the patrol ship didn't deploy with its usual planetary surveillance drone, so it had to rely on long-range visual scanners to get a look at the structure. The image that appeared on the survey monitor was a grainy, pixelated image of varying shades of black and dark greys, and it took another 8 hours before the imaging computers could finally clear up the picture. The amazed crew were presented with the image of the wreckage of a starship half buried in the grey, rocky soil. What was visible above ground was roughly 60 feet of a long, broken outer hull of a vessel that was charred black by intense heat. Structures which appeared to have once been giant sensor arrays and communication towers had long collapsed, and the gutted interior of the vessel could be seen like ribs protruding from a long-dead animal carcass. The images were sent to UTG Fleet Command Headquarters on Mars for examination, and after an extensive search of archival space exploration data and ancient starship designs, the tragic story of how this ship came to grief on Ganymede was revealed. The ship was confirmed to be a Lieutenant-class exploration vessel whose original hull dimensions were 190 feet long by 80 feet at its widest section and a crew complement of 60. The Lieutenant class was one of the very earliest of the exploration ships launched from Earth, its mission being to scout ahead and find habitable planets for the larger colonizer vessels to exploit. However, the Lieutenant-class ships, with their Generation 1 guidance and navigation systems, were notorious for being inaccurate, though they didn't know it at the time, and the revolutionary hyperdrive propulsion still had many bugs in the system which had yet to be worked out. Before long, a morbid whispered joke began to spread throughout the fleet that the most dangerous thing to exist was a lieutenant class with a compass. Before the days when the role of colonizer vessel and explorer vessel were combined into one massive starship back in the 2150s, explorer and colonizer ships launched in pairs, with the objective being that the explorer ship led the way using its advanced, long-range sensors to locate a suitable target body in space, while the colonizer ship provided the habitation, hydroponics, terraforming equipment, and everything else needed to sustain life and exploit the planetary resources. The colonizer ship's hyperdrive was synced with the explorer ship's hyperdrive, so that the two vessels would not get separated during jumps into hyperspace. The mysterious vessel which the patrol ship discovered was the Lieutenant-class United Terran government ship UTGS Creepen that had been partnered with the 600-foot-long Dahlia-class colonizer ship UTGS Jakarta City, which had a complement of 800 colonists and ship's crew. The UTGS Creepen and the Jakarta City launched from Earth sometime between 2089 and 2091, and after they passed the Moon's orbital arc, the two ships jumped into hyperspace, with the Creepen's navigational systems plotting the trajectory towards a promising star cluster in the Proxima Centauri system. They were never seen or heard from again for almost 100 years, until the carcass of the UTGS Creepen was inadvertently found on Ganymede. From what UTG Fleet Command Headquarters on Mars could piece together, early space exploration vessels used to use the gravitational force of Jupiter, Saturn, or Neptune to assist in flinging the ship out of the solar system while in hyperspace. Though the practice was dangerous and long made obsolete by today's advanced technology, it was a common practice hundreds of years ago. The Creepen and the Jakarta City were the first to attempt an even more daring operation. In order to reach the far Proxima Centauri system, it would be necessary for them to slingshot from Jupiter to Saturn, then use the combined gravitational force of both planets to enter hyperspace at the velocity needed to push them to their final destination. Sometime between the jump from Earth orbit to Jupiter, the guidance system of the UTGS Creepen suffered a catastrophic failure. As she attempted to use Jupiter's gravitational force to slingshot both herself and the Jakarta City beyond the boundaries of the solar system, the Creepen's primitive long-range proximity computer malfunctioned, apparently indicating that Jupiter was Proxima Centauri. Near Jupiter, the Creepen's faulty long-range proximity computer caused the ship to be immediately pulled from hyperspace without the necessary deceleration time to slow to normal warp speed, which at the time was approximately a week to 10 days. It was estimated that this sudden deceleration in forward motion resulted in the crew of the Creepen suffering the force of over 150,000 Gs, which violently but mercifully smashed them into atoms in less than 2 seconds. The forward motion of the ship, combined with the gravitational force of the planet Jupiter, flung the doomed exploration vessel directly into Ganymede, the battered hull of the Creepen gashing a ragged trail on the surface of the Moon for nearly 300 miles, before she ultimately settled in her final resting place. Considering the battering that she took, it was a miracle that so much of her hull survived the crash, and it's a testament to how sturdy, resilient, and well-constructed the early space exploration ships were. Today, the site where the UTGS Creepen came to grief is now a memorial to honor and remember those intrepid souls who literally flung themselves into space during the early days of space colonization and exploitation for the good of the government, the corporations, and the citizenry. Still, one giant mystery remained. The colonizer ship UTGS Jakarta City, with 800 souls aboard, were also linked to the Creepen's navigational system, meaning that what happened to the Creepen should have, theoretically, happened to the Jakarta City. Yet no signs of the colonizer ship were found, and the fate of the Jakarta City would remain a mystery for centuries. Alpha Centauri System, Terran Year 2229. At around Terran Year 2150, during the time when the United Terran government began perfecting the combination of explorer and colonizer vessels into one giant ship simply known as a colonizer, it also became standard practice for long-range starships to drop marker buoys, nuclear-powered signaling devices which left a trail of the ship's travels through space. As mankind marked its first 100 years of space exploitation, the UTG began a new push into the Alpha Centauri system. A half-dozen of the new colonizer vessels will be making this journey, among them being the new Florensky-class starship, UTGS Florensky, the first of its class built at the Florensky shipbuilding yards, which itself was built inside the largest impact crater on Earth's moon, and named after the planetologist who discovered it, Kirili Florensky. She was an unusually shaped vessel, 1,200 feet long and 400 feet at its widest section, which was the box-shaped aft section that contained the ship's 2 hyperdrive generators and 3 warp drive engines. The middle section was considerably narrower and contained the 200-foot-long radiation buffers, followed by the secondary power generators, life support systems, and cargo hold. The remainder of the Florensky was taken up by the ovular-shaped fore section, which contained the main operational and habitation areas, consisting of 3 decks, as well as the lower deck, which housed the 2 hangar bays, containing the ship-to-shore shuttles and additional cargo holds for the cattle and livestock. Comfortable, if somewhat cramped, the Florensky held a crew and passenger complement of 900 personnel. The UTGS Florensky, along with 4 other colonizer vessels, successfully emerged from hyperspace at the rim of the Alpha Centauri system, following the same jump coordinates used by the first colonizers who pushed into the system some 70 years ago. After sending a light-speed message back to UTG Fleet headquarters on Mars, that 5 of the 6 colonizers had finally arrived at the initial coordinate destination, the fleet of 5 colonizer ships cruised together for some 2 weeks, checking systems and running equipment tests, before finally wishing each other corporate blessings and government speed, as each of the colonizer starships dropped away from the fleet and changed course towards their own separate coordinates and separate fates. For the next 4 months, the Florensky traveled alone in the endless black void, his long-range planetary scanners searching for that ever-elusive needle in a haystack, the Class 1 planetary body in a celestial system capable of sustaining human life without the need of specialized life support systems such as external oxygen supplies or thermal survival suits. In other words, a planet not too unlike Earth. By way of comparison, both Earth's moon and Mars were considered Class 5 TL planetary bodies, inhospitable for human habitation, terraformable, limited mining possibilities. In terms of space exploration, these 2 celestial bodies would normally have been rejected for colonization, but out of necessity and human survival, both were transformed into Class 1 habitations, which is now home to over 1 billion inhabitants. During the preceding 6 months, the Florensky had little success in finding a habitable celestial body, though she did discover an unusual Class 5 moon orbiting a Class 8 gas giant incapable of sustaining carbon life. This moon, one of about 17 that orbited the gas giant, was about 2/3 the size of Earth's moon, but whose mass was over 35% gold. Marking this moon as a possible future mining colony, the Florensky pressed on, her warp engines propelling her from planetary system to planetary system. On the 4th month of the journey into the Alpha Centauri system, the Florensky intercepted a subspace distress message from one of the other colonizer ships, the UTGS Able Bay. The garbled message was voice-only and barely readable, but contained the startling phrases, "Out of nowhere, Class 1, under attack." The last phrase of the loop message caused considerable consternation aboard the Florensky. The distress call was just over 1 month old, calculating the distance it took for the subspace transmission to reach them. Still, obedience had to be given to the directives put forth by the United Terran government, directives which did not include guidelines for a ship captain to change course from a predetermined course in order to aid another colonizer vessel. Loyalty had to be maintained to the government and the corporations only. As would be proven decades later, 2 or more colonizer ships working in unison would prove problematic to the UTG. On the 6th month of exploration, the long-range scanners picked up on an unusual anomaly. A metallic cylindrical object, roughly 5 feet in diameter, was floating 450,000 miles from the Florensky and was sending out a weak signal. Upon closer inspection of the object, the crew of the Florensky discovered that it was one of the marker buoys left behind from one of the first colonizer expeditions into the system over 3/4 of a century earlier. The weak telemetry data which the marker buoy was transmitting indicated that the buoy was dropped by the colonizer ship UTGS Ark Harvest, one of the first starship designs which combined the colonizer and explorer class vessels. Historical data files recorded that UTG Fleet Headquarters received a transmission from the Ark Harvest 77 years ago with an initial report that they'd discovered a Class 2 planet, meaning that they had located a planet which the long-range scanners indicated had between a 50 and 70% similarity with Earth. The excited crew of the Ark Harvest promised to send another transmission to the homeworld in 6 months after they'd conducted the initial reconnaissance and exploration of the planet. With any luck, the planet, named simply ACX 447C2, would be found to be completely habitable, thus changing its classification to a Class 1 planet. That second transmission, however, never came. For the next 2 months, the hopeful crew of the Florensky followed in the trail of the Ark Harvest, during which time they came across an additional 2 more signal buoys, but no signs of the Ark Harvest itself, or the mysterious Class 2 planet which they supposedly found. 2 more months passed with no other buoys being located, and no scanner hits of any planets even remotely habitable. The crew of the Florensky were quickly losing hope, thinking this was nothing but a wild goose chase to catch a red herring, when our long-range scanners alerted the crew of another anomaly. This time a large metallic object or objects drifting around an obscure dwarf star, roughly 270 million miles distant. The Florensky changed course to investigate this new clue, hoping to get a better picture with the medium-range scanners and the short-range visuals. When they finally got into visual range, the picture presented to the crew provided far more questions than it did answers. The image that confronted the shocked crew was what appeared to be a section of a much larger structure, more than likely a starship, roughly cylindrical in shape. The metallic object was a little over 300 feet long and 200 feet in diameter, and tapered to a wedged point. It was colored a deep yellow with a broad white stripe that bisected the object. On the white stripe were the letters VEST, written in a broad, stylistic font. The discovery, no matter how startling, wasn't what shocked the crew of the Florensky. Rather, it was the multiple black holes which pockmarked the object, as if it had been impacted by multiple small meteorites that penetrated the hull's outer hull. As if it had been impacted by multiple small meteorites that had penetrated the object's outer hull. As they neared the object and sensors could get improved readings, the suspicions of the crew had also been confirmed. They were indeed looking at the fore section of the lost, 950-foot-long colonizer ship Ark Harvest, though what caused such damage to a vessel traveling in open space remained a mystery. More stunning was that the telemetry readings confirmed that the holes which had been punched into the Ark Harvest weren't made by meteorites. The shocking report stated that the damage had been caused by something that projected a concentrated amount of very high heat, much like the military's plasma rifles, also known as flame guns, but on a much greater scale. Immediately, the memory of the Able Bay's last transmission, where they used the phrase, "under attack," haunted the crew of the Florensky. A minuscule power reading emanating from the Ark Harvest's wedge-shaped foresection was caused to send a shuttle from the Florensky to investigate. Successfully attaching tethers to the floating husk, the shuttle's boarding team managed to spacewalk to what remained of the Ark Harvest and, utilizing the maglocks on their boots, the team penetrated into the black interior of the derelict ship, making for the weak energy source at the front of the vessel. What was left of the inner hull was charred black, as if a conflagration as hot as a sun had spread rapidly through every inch of the interior. What hadn't been vaporized instantly had been blown into the void of space when the Ark Harvest blew apart. Still, there was an energy source, minuscule as may be, and it was coming from behind a thick bulkhead which, while damaged, wasn't breached. It took a critically long time for the team to finally gain access through the bulkhead, and their oxygen supply had become critical, but every member of the team wanted to know what was on the other side. Once again, what confronted the search team left more questions than answers. A rectangular opening had been cut into the front of the hull. Out of this protruded a long, thin barrel-shaped cylinder. At its base, connected to the barrel, was what appeared to be a generator or an extremely large energy projection capacitor. The whole thing was mounted on a rotating base, and built into the base were 2 metal reclining seats upon which the long-dead bodies of 2 of the Ark Harvest's crew were seated. Whatever the thing was, it was clearly alien in nature. It didn't take a hyperdrive scientist to realize that the contraption was some type of alien energy casting weapon, so powerful that it still gave off a residual energy reading long after it had been fired. Whatever destroyed the Ark Harvest, the crew of the ship did not go down without a fight. Somehow the crew managed to acquire the same example of the alien weapon, which was presumably used to destroy the Ark Harvest. The two intrepid crew members were wearing full environmental survival suits. This small compartment was completely open to the unforgiving void of space, hence the thick bulkhead which separated them from the rest of the ship. The right station seat mounted a primitive monitor used for target acquisition, while the left station seat mounted an energy output monitor and a sophisticated trigger mechanism. The two valiant gunners had apparently died at their posts, fighting against whatever it was that killed their ship. For the first time in recorded human history, a broken arrow message was sent from a vessel in deep space to the home world system, a risky process which required a 6-hour delay while all ship systems, including life support, were transmitted to the main communications array tower. This concentrated power would enable the ship to transmit a brief message as well as a finite amount of telemetry data across the cosmos to the homeworld in a matter of a few days, as opposed to a few months. This was a sort of dead man switch, meant to inform the home planets of a catastrophic event that would lead to the imminent demise of the ship. The cost of sending such a message was staggering. It would require an average of 12 days for the ship to regenerate minimal operating power once the broken arrow message was sent. In the meantime, the ship would be left drifting in space, using minimal life support for just the crew compartments. And this would mean that life support would be cut to all other areas of the ship, including the holding areas for cattle and livestock. Additionally, the power to send the message would be more than the communication array could handle. It was estimated that there would only be a 50% chance at best to bring them back online. It was, however, a chance well worth taking. Not only that, it was a mandatory directive dictated by the corporation that any first encounter with an alien advanced species, or technology, or habitation, or more importantly, weapon system, was a condition to initiate a broken arrow message. And as predicted, the sending of such a message completely blew out the communications array of the Florensky and set her uncontrollably adrift on absolute minimal life support power only. However, after only 11 days, the seemingly lifeless hulk of the UTGS Florensky suddenly sprang back to life as minimal operating power had been restored and the emergency batteries had generated enough power to attempt starting the warp engines. First priority, however, was to attempt to get the communication array operational again, if at all possible. Against all odds, the black monitor screens of the communication station suddenly lit up, each monitor flashing a white and red Priority 1 Alpha 6 message from the home planet, a direct communication from the President of the United Terran government itself. It was a brief message, one which left no doubts as to Florensky's next course of action. The Commander, or next senior officer, United Terran government ship Krill Florensky. As soon as it is possible or permissible, extract and secure said artifact from the UTGS Ark Harvest and return to start point with all haste. If such a feat is not possible, you will expend all possible resources to secure the artifact on board your vessel and await retrieval from follow-on resources or, barring that, mark said artifact in such a way that follow-on resources can relocate it. Signed, Ji Jin, President, United Terran Government Prime, Asian Continental Authority. With that message, it was the first time in recorded human history that the United Terran Government had ever issued a recall order for a colonizer vessel to return back to the home system and, as history would later record, it was a good thing that it had. Still, the captain of the UTGS Florensky had been left with the lingering feeling that the underlying reason why the Globo Corporation sent the 6 colonizer ships to Alpha Centauri wasn't really to find life-sustainable planets, but rather to bring back exactly what he and his crew had stumbled upon. The United Terran government had recently been receiving reports, rumors actually, that at least one of the missing colonizer ships sent to Alpha Centauri over 75 years ago had found a Class 1 planet. But instead of sending their tithes, offerings, and sacrifices to the benevolent United Terran government, they instead decided to cut all ties with the home system. This, of course, could not stand. The corporations and the government had poured a vast amount of money and research into the exploration and exploitation of the cosmos. Allowing a rogue colony in Alpha Centauri to break away would set a very dangerous and non-profitable precedent, to which a UTG naval fleet armed with powerful plasma weapons would be a very effective deterrent. Vega X, the Sirius system, Terran Year 2318. Barely 2 decades into the new century, mankind was marking several remarkable achievements in its cosmic expansion. Within the home system, the new founded colonies on the dwarf planet Sirius and the giant Jupiter moon of Ganymede had successfully struck an almost endless supply of water under the icy surfaces, and the desalinization facilities on both colonies were working overtime to clean and purify the water for distribution to the home planets and Earth colonies scattered across the galaxy. On Venus, the experiment of seeding the clouds with phosphine gases with algae bioreactors resulted in an almost explosive growth of an algae-like substance which thrived in its new floating environment. Scientists studying this remarkable development were convinced that, with increased seeding of Venus's atmosphere, the resulting strain of floating algae may be a source of biofuels and a source of non-perishable feed to supply the citizenry whom the corporations have been pushing further and further out into the galaxy. Thanks to their selfless sacrifices for the good of the corporation, government, and, of course, mankind, several new and habitable planets had been discovered. Among these discoveries was a rare Class 1 which orbited a star 3 times the size of Earth's Sun in the Sirius system. Known as Vega X, it was roughly 8/10 the size of Earth and was the 9th of 15 planets orbiting that system's sun. The planet was 85% crystal blue water on which lush, picturesque virginal islands floated. It didn't take long for mankind's elite 1% to realize what a tropical vacation haven Vega X could become. Soon, Vega X, which was now nicknamed Vega's Triple X to the common citizenry, was deemed off-limits to all except mankind's most important 1%, including chief executives, influential politicians, corporate heads, heads of state, lobbyists, sport entertainers, celebrities, and anyone else from the elite upper tier who sacrificed and gave so much for the cause of humanity. Earth was no longer the polluted, war-ravaged, dystopian planet that it once was centuries ago. After nearly 300 years of Earth's elites sending the riffraff and dregs of humanity off into space, Mother Nature slowly began to reclaim and heal the planet. By the turn of the century, however, many of Earth's elites had also left the Earth to stake their claims on the first fruits of humanity's most promising interstellar conquests. Despite the fact that some friction may have existed between Earth and the governing authority of Mars, Earth was still considered the birthplace of humanity and the seat of humanity's growing galactic influence. It was, for lack of a better term, the home of where the old money resided. For those who held the purse strings of that old money, one of the most favorite places for the Earth's elites to vacation was the pleasure planet of Vega X. In Terran Year 2320, the regional chancellor of the North American Continental Authority, Mabin Abode, a powerful and loyal sycophant of the corporations, won another re-election by a landslide 81 million votes. By way of celebration, hundreds of the North American continent's most important ruling class and influential citizens, including politicians, corporate executives, entertainers, the propaganda ministry, and of course Chancellor Mabin Abode and her entourage, boarded the elegant Scrupulsome, a sleek luxury star cruiser with a red and silver mirrored finish. It was considered to be one of the most opulent liners on the continent, if not the world. Normally, the journey to Vega X would take an agonizingly long 4 weeks, but the trip would by no means be an unpleasant one for the very important elite guests of the 400-foot-long luxury liner. On the Scruplesome, if you weren't one of the VIP elites, then you were a servant of the VIP elites, on call all day, every day to serve and service those elites who made the galaxy go round. Still, once the Scruplesome reached Vega X, the elites would still have to wait for as long as a day or even a week before they could get to the surface. Because of the very strict restrictions imposed on the planetary government to protect the fragile, pristine environment, absolutely no starship will be allowed to perform a water landing on the planet, not even a luxury cruiser like the Scruplesome and her mega-elite passengers. Instead, an orbital port was constructed over Vega X where luxury cruise liners would dock and transfer their passengers to the awaiting shuttles that were waiting obediently to take their wealthy, powerful, and influential guests to the planet's surface and the myriad of pleasures that awaited them. Fortunately, and by design, the orbital port of Vega X was a relatively small facility, capable of servicing only a limited number of starliners, so as to limit the number of guests wishing to flood the planet. To avoid the inevitable scheduling headaches of the galaxy's elite citizens crowding into the space dock, the Planetary Authority hit upon a simple solution. First come, first served. Once a liner announced its intention to dock, they were more than welcome to drop into orbit and wait their turn in line behind the liners already ahead of it. While this was a fair and equitable scheduling arrangement, it would not do for the Chancellor of the second most powerful of Earth's continental governing authorities and her highly powerful and influential guests. They were, after all, the elite 1% of the elite 1%. Chancellor Abode's benefactors had spent a considerable amount of money to influence the election in her favor, and it wouldn't do to have them waiting above Vega X behind elites who weren't as elite as they were. Unfortunately, the captain of the Scruplesome had come into possession of hyperspace jump coordinates, which would bring the ship to a point that would put it ahead of any other starliner, thus ensuring that the Scruplesome would have a prime spot on the Vega orbital port. Chancellor Abode's personal aides eagerly agreed to the captain's scheme, eager to impress the leader of the North American Continental Authority and perhaps be rewarded by a bump to second-class citizen. Right on schedule, the Scruplesome departed Earth's orbit, headed to the playground of the galaxy's rich and famous. 4 weeks later, the Scruplesome arrived in the Vega X system and, as promised, the hyperspace jump coordinates had put the luxury liner far ahead of any other liner that was cruising under warp power towards the planet. Curiously, however, when the Vega orbital spaceport attempted to raise the Scruplesome to inform her that the United Terran government had reserved a special dock for them so they would not have to wait for an empty port, there was no reply in return. The attempt to raise the Scruplesome continued for several minutes with no response, and soon the situation became critical when the Scruplesome's forward inertia had it on a collision course with the Vega orbital facility. A tug was immediately dispatched to the errant starliner to tow it back to the port. To the shock of the crew of the tug, the once beautiful luxury liner with her distinctive red and silver mirrored finish appeared like it had been abandoned in the Mongolian desert for half a century. Much of the reflective red and silver coating that once covered the ship had now been worn away, revealing the dull metal beneath. The hull of the ship had ripples and showed signs of extreme metal fatigue. All of the small protrusions had been bent or worn away, and a myriad of wires and components hung from the openings in the paneling which had broken away from the hull. Absolutely no power emanated from the ship, including propulsion and life support. As soon as the Scruplesome was carefully secured into the dock reserved for it, the main entrance hatch was forcefully pried open. Horror awaited those who entered, as they found no living person inside. Not only was the newly re-elected Chancellor Mabine Abode, her entourage, and all of the very important elites who came with her dead, their mummified remains indicated that they'd passed away a very long time ago. More horrifyingly, many of the bodies show signs that they'd been systematically butchered and eaten. Almost immediately, the United Terran government launched what would become the the most intensive cover-up of an interstellar tragedy in recorded history. This wasn't just some missing colonizer ship holding thousands of common citizenry. The passengers aboard this particular luxury vessel were actually important. The data recorders recovered from the Scrupulsome revealed the tragic and grotesque fate of those who were aboard her. They revealed that the ship's captain did indeed utilize a previously unknown coordinate to initiate the jump into hyperspace towards Vega X. However, those coordinates put the Scrupulsome into what could only be described as a wormhole. What was once a subject of theory and conjecture was now proven to be a reality. It is unknown when or at what point the Scrupulsome entered this wormhole, but when the concerned crew entered the captain's stateroom to alert him of the situation, as he was the one who personally entered the jump coordinates, they were shocked to find him sitting in a chair facing one of the wide viewports, which showed only a brilliant white light, the effect of the stars passing the viewport at such a fast rate. The captain was dead, a cup of Earl Grey tea laced with poison sitting on a table next to him. Whether he was poisoned or he poisoned himself is still up for debate, but regardless, the passengers and crew of the Scrupulsome now found themselves in a situation where they were now trapped inside of a wormhole where the exit point had yet to be determined. Helm and navigation stations attempted to adjust coordinates to bring the liner out of the wormhole, but to no avail, as the override codes were in the captain's personal log, and beside the captain, only the first officer and chief engineer had access to this log. Suspiciously, however, when they tried to access those codes, the first officer found that they'd been completely erased. Again, whether this was sabotage or whether it was the captain that erased his own logs before committing suicide was beyond the point of concern, as the crew's first priority was to safeguard the VIPs and get out of the wormhole. 6 hours later, with the VIPs panicking and the first officer considering the possibilities and consequences of manually adjusting course, the proximity alert was sounded, indicating that they were approaching the Vega X system. That, of course, was impossible, since the system was 4 weeks away, and they were only 12 hours into the journey. Almost as instantly as the proximity alarm sounded, it shut off, meaning that they had passed the Vega X system. At this point, Chancellor Abode demanded that the first officer bring them out of the wormhole by manually adjusting course. When the first officer tried to explain the dangers of doing so at the extreme speeds they were attaining, Chancellor Abode loudly overruled him. She was seconded by her entourage, the VIP politicians, the VIP chief executives, the VIP entertainers, and all of the lesser elites that she brought with her. Reluctantly, the first officer instructed the helm to change course, 1/2 degree at a time. However, no sooner had the ship moved a 1/2 degree did she start to buckle and shake. Warning alarms began to blare as the passengers lost their footing. Diamond chandeliers began rattling violently. Priceless paintings fell from the walls, and the exotic foods began vibrating and falling from the buffet tables. Immediately, the first officer ordered the ship back onto its original trajectory, and the ship obediently corrected itself before it shook itself to pieces. It was immediately obvious that a course correction of as much as 1 degree would rip the ship apart. With her white pantsuit now stained burgundy from spilled champagne, Chancellor Abode threw the rest of the drink from her glass into the first officer's face. Accusing him of misconduct and incompetence, she again ordered him and the crew to find a way out of this predicament, as elites from across the galaxy were waiting at Vega X to celebrate her well-deserved and well-paid-for victory. Several questions plagued the first officer and chief engineer. The most concerning was the death of the captain and the erasure of his files. The captain was relatively new to the ship, having taken over after the previous captain retired after achieving the status of second-class citizen. The new captain was Martian-born and raised, and, curiously, the UTG-MA had recently done away with the citizen class system. In addition, the UTG-MA, or United Terran Government Mars Authority, had been opposed to Earth mounting plasma-based weapons capable of vaporizing off-world colonies on her naval vessels. Something Chancellor Abode promised she would push for once she won re-election. But was this reason for the captain to sabotage his ship and commit suicide? Well, it seemed unlikely, as he appeared in every way to be loyal and steadfast to the Terran Authority. Theories, hypotheses, and conjectures were input into the ship's computers and tested, a process which took some time and patience. The ship's navigational system still recorded that the Scrupulsome was still on track to drop out of hyperspace in less than 4 weeks, so, at most, this ordeal would be over in a few weeks. However, the ship's chronological trackers seemed to have been damaged earlier, as it stopped counting time, though personal watches and timepieces continued working normally. The crew was busily researching whether or not this would affect the time they were scheduled to drop out of hyperspace in the wormhole, or if this was simply a technical glitch in the system. 12 hours later, with the VAPs again threatening the ship's officers with imprisonment and demotion to fourth-class citizens, the proximity alert sounded, indicating that they were approaching Vega X again. As this happened, the ship's chronology recorder advanced 1 second. The first officer made note of this and, sure enough, after another 24 hours had passed, the proximity alert sounded that they were approaching the Vega X system again, and once again the ship's chronological tracker advanced 1 second. It was then that the horrified crew realized the terrifying situation they were facing. The captain had input coordinates into an extremely rare circular wormhole. This type of wormhole was one which wound into itself, much like the tracks of a Magna rail system that started at one point and passed through several other points in a circular route until reaching its own starting point again. The Scrupulsome was indeed scheduled to drop out of hyperspace in 4 weeks in real time, but within the wormhole, where 24 hours equaled 1 second, for the passengers and crew of the Scrupulsome, the actual time they would be spending inside the wormhole before they finally dropped out of hyperspace would be a little over 6,600 years. What happened next was the unthinkable. After the initial stores of food had been consumed, it's known that the ship's first officer, who'd been demoted to fourth-class citizen, was the first to offer himself as sacrifice for food. It's not known who the next person was who was butchered for food, or if the order was drawn by citizen class, elitist status, importance for the ship's functions, age, or if the next to be butchered was simply chosen by lot. Did alliances form between Chancellor Abode and the elites against the lower-class crew? Did the crew do away with the class system, and did the situation devolve to the strong preying on the weak? Such gruesome details were deemed classified from the data files which the government recovered and never released. Also classified from public release was whether or not the captain was actually an insurgent working for some radical wing of the Mars Authority to jeopardize the ties between Mars and Earth. Some even speculated, in secret whispers, that the captain was actually acting under UTG orders, capitalizing on an assassination of Chancellor Abode as a pretext for arming UTG naval fleet ships with powerful plasma cannons, a move soundly opposed by Mars Authority and many of the off-world governing authorities. What ended up being released by the UTG Cosmic Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was that an unidentified operative from the Alpha Centauri colonies had bribed the Scrupulosume's captain into inputting those errant coordinates in order to assassinate the Chancellor as a warning to the UTG. In any event, the horrific fate of Chancellor Abode and the elite 1% of the North American Continental Authority was the impetus which the UTG needed to begin arming her naval fleets, now called war fleets, with the new plasma weapons. The rogue colonies of Alpha Centauri, which now numbered 13 and were collectively known as the Constitutional Republics of New Columbia, were going to pay for their revolutionary treachery. Hyboria Major System, Proxima Centauri. Terran Year 2587. In 2476, after a ceasefire was agreed upon with the now independent 13 colonies of the Constitutional Republics of New Columbia, it took the United Terran government nearly a century to rebuild and re-establish her colonies. The UTG had suffered a contraction in galactic influence after the war, as several of the near-rim colonies chose to ally themselves with the constitutional republics, which, by 2587, now numbered 50 states. Once again, the search for Class 1 planets with a ready water supply took precedence, and the push to discover new worlds began again in earnest, at a pace not seen for hundreds of years. During this time, ship designs grew even larger, the corporations finding it to be more profitable to build one massive, multi-role ship rather than smaller ships which specialized in one or two operations. One such vessel was the UTGS Kaleidoscope, a massive ship nearly 4,000 feet long and 500 feet wide. She was specifically to operate on a newly discovered Class 2 planet in Proxima Centauri known as Hyboria Major, a planet roughly 3 times the size of Earth, whose elliptical orbit around the system's sun took approximately 37 Earth months. Hyboria Major was a very fortuitous discovery. She was 90 to 95% water, though during 14 months out of its year, most of the seas were nearly frozen over as the average planetary temperature dropped to minus 90 degrees Celsius. However, during the spring and summer, which usually lasted for 15 months, the temperatures ranged from a balmy 26 degrees Celsius to a sweltering 60 degrees, during which time aqua harvesting operations could be conducted. The UTGS Kaleidoscope was unique in that after she made splashdown to Hyboria Major, her crew of 3,800 would then get to work assembling the prefabricated components stored within the vessel, which would turn the Kaleidoscope into a 140 square acre floating aquaport to service the corporation's freighters, which would be expected to conduct water harvesting operations soon after the Kaleidoscope's conversion. In addition, the Kaleidoscope also carried several small submersible vehicles, as well as one 200-foot-long research submarine to begin initial exploration of the ocean depths. Eventually, if all went well, the UTG had plans to expand the port facility by a few square miles, effectively turning it into a small city dedicated to exploiting the planet's untapped resources. Government politicians were acutely aware of the potential profits of this venture, and hardly had to be forced to accept any money from corporate lobbyists to authorize funding for the Globo corporations to begin this bold new project. In 2581, the Kaleidoscope reported that it made a successful splashdown on Hyboria Major several hundred miles south of the planet's equator. It was the height of the summer in this hemisphere, and the seas proved to be rougher than expected. Using the ship's atmospheric drive, something which was done infrequently with large vessels such as the Kaleidoscope because of the amount of power was needed, she finally set down hundreds of miles further south where the seas were calmer. The plan was to begin initial construction through the summer and 4 months while the scientific teams initiated the preliminary research into the water samples, biological life forms, aquatic vegetation, mineral deposits, and everything else which may be exploited by the corporation for the good of humanity and the profit of the elites. The actual heavy construction would take place during the winter months when the oceans froze over to a depth of roughly 1 mile, and the heavy equipment could safely traverse over the ice to complete the rest of the construction. The first Hyborian year was a difficult one for the construction crews. Despite sometimes working 24-hour shifts when the seas and weather permitted, they were still 12 months behind schedule owing to the sometimes uncooperative seas which could conjure monster waves which, fortunately, only claimed the lives of a few hundred workers. This, coupled with the high winds, incessant rains, and the occasional attack by one of the biological species native to the planet which lurked under the waves, conspired to put the final construction well behind schedule, and, by the end of the first 37-month year, the port facility was only 70% completed. The chief executive in charge of completing construction of the facility was reduced from a first-class citizen to a third-class citizen by the corporation, though he was still in charge of the whole operation. This meant that a third-class citizen would be giving orders to second-class citizens who were foremen in charge of hundreds of workers. The corporation hoped that this humiliation would inspire and motivate the thousands of third-class citizen workers to work harder and faster to produce the results and the profits which would benefit galactic humanity, no matter the personal sacrifices. In contrast, the scientific research teams had been amassing data in leaps and bounds. The seas abounded with biological life forms which resembled the aquatic life forms of creatures over 400 million years ago during Earth's Ordovician period, though these armored, tentacled mollusk, squid, octopus, and crab-shaped creatures could grow to hundreds of feet in length. Additionally, there were sea creatures which had followed the evolutionary process which produced gargantuan creatures resembling Earth's prehistoric reptiles, like the Mosasaurus, as well as a shark-like species resembling the dreaded megalodon, though these species were over twice the size of their Earth counterparts, and the occasional encounters with these predatory species resulted in tragic losses to crews operating the small 2- and 3-man submersibles. In fact, losses were so great that it became forbidden to utilize the small submersibles anymore. Still, the corporation demanded more data regarding potential subsurface life forms and resources which could be exploited for future profit, especially from a form of deep-sea seaweed which was discovered that had shown to be high in nutrients and which could possibly be processed into feed for human consumption. The seeding of Venus's clouds had resulted in the creation of some stunning floating gardens, but tests on human consumption of the algae-like vegetation showed that it interacted with human biochemistry in such a way that it turned the person consuming it into a type of grotesque and mindless plant-human hybrid that sought to consume human flesh in a deranged attempt to revert back into a human again. This unfortunate side effect was discovered when UTG fleet marines responded to a distress call from the scientific research station orbiting above Venus. Upon infiltrating into the station, the Marines found that the 500 scientists and technicians assigned there had either been devoured or transformed into one of those humanoid vegetable creatures. After fighting their way back to the ship, the Marines detonated the explosives that they planted on the station's orbital gravimetric stabilizers, which sent the facility plummeting into Venus. Wisely, the corporation and the UTG blamed the loss of the facility on sabotage by fascist terrorists from the Constitutional Republic of New Columbia. In so doing, the corporation avoided any harmful litigation from the families of the lost scientists, while at the same time pushing the anti-constitutional republic political rhetoric of the benevolent United Terran government. Still, that left the UTG with the problem of feeding the billions of outer system colonists did not have a local means of sustained food production, which is why the corporation insisted that research into exploiting the aquatic plant life on Hyboria Major for food production must continue, no matter how dangerous. To this end, the 200-foot-long submarine which they brought with them was modified to emit a 50,000 volt of electricity from its outer hull which, in the water, was effective out to about 1,000 feet from the submarine. She was named Deep Dive 6 and required a crew of 28. Her mission was to descend nearly 2.5 miles down to where an expansive bed of the seaweed was located and collect enough samples to study and determine if it could be converted into a nutritious, non-perishable food source for the masses of billions struggling so valiantly for the good of the corporations. Early in Terran Year 2585, the Kaleidoscope sent a message to the UTG on Earth that the submarine Deep Dive 6 would be departing shortly for the seabed, and a second transmission would be sent in another 24 hours to report on the success of the mission. 24 hours later, UTG Fleet Command received a second transmission saying that the Deep Dive 6 had encountered an unknown biological animal that was now at the bottom of the seafloor, and that rescue operations were underway. As it turned out, that was the last message ever received by the Kaleidoscope. It was 2 Terran years before another UTG ship arrived to Hyboria Major in Terran Year 2587. Fearing that the loss of communication with the Kaleidoscope may have been a result of an attack by the rogue constitutional republics, the UTG naval fleet dispatched the heavy frigate UTGS Kosovo to the planet, a 700-foot-long warship armed with several kinetic energy weapons, missile launch tubes, and 1 medium-range plasma gun. After scans confirmed that no other vessels were in the area, UTG or otherwise, the Kosovo made a successful splashdown on the planet's surface during the latter part of the hemisphere's spring season, when the seas were at their calmest, and sailed to within a mile of the kaleidoscope. The entire kaleidoscope was listing to one side, at a 15-degree angle, and fully a quarter of the facility was underwater. Half of what was visible above water was tinged green with moss and algae, and signs of rust was forming along the entire facility. There was only minimal power emanating from her, meaning that her nuclear reactors were offline, and she was running on fading backup generator power only. Shockingly, the part of the kaleidoscope which submerged underwater was covered with a thick bed of some kind of seaweed several feet deep, but like the kaleidoscope, it seemed to be dead. A platoon of a dozen Marine raiders boarded one of the Kosovo's aerospace assault ships, known as a Helios gunship, and headed for the wreckage of the kaleidoscope. Because she was listing at an extreme angle, the gunship had to land facing upslope, the maglocks on her landing skids securing her to the slippery landing deck. Once the rear ramp was lowered, the Marines quickly scampered out, the maglocks on their boots keeping them from slipping on the slimy moss-covered deck, although the going was still awkward due to the listing of the facility. Unfortunately, the two large yellow radiation-proof cases which the Marines had brought with them also tumbled out of the back, clanging noisily down the landing ramp before tumbling over the side to crash 30 feet to the metal deck below. The Marines encountered no signs of life as they secured the area around the gunship, though in reality, theirs wasn't a rescue mission. They weren't here to find survivors. They were here to gather all of the data recorders they could find, destroy the station, and get out. By this time, the UTG had developed a new design for a platform where the entire structure would be constructed in orbit. Once the fully completed 2-mile square functional station was assembled, it would be landed on Hyboria Major's surface as one massive structure. In the 2 years since contact had been lost with the kaleidoscope, the corporation and the UTG considered the kaleidoscope and her crew obsolete and consequently expendable. The move to the central command bridge was relatively simple, despite the awkward angle in which the Marines had to climb. The dead vines of seaweed seemed to be everywhere, creating a carpet of the dead aquatic vegetation which crunched under the Marines' boots. The individual strands of seaweed were about an inch thick and wrapped with numerous leaves that resembled little green mushrooms, which were concave rather than convex. And within each of these leaves were small spikes, allowing the seaweed to grasp and cling like the tentacle of an earth octopus. In some places, the remains of the weird vegetation completely covered corridors and entire passageways in an impassable quagmire of rotting seaweed which, if not for the oxygen masks the Marines wore, would have overcome them with a putrid smell like that of decaying fish. The seaweed was so prevalent in the northeast section of the facility, the section that was listing into the ocean, that access to the main communications network array had been completely blocked, which is possibly why the station never sent out a distress signal. Not that it would have worked, as so much of the fetid-smelling seaweed had wrapped itself around the antennae arrays that they'd been bent and damaged to such a degree that a message would never have reached the home worlds. The question was, for that to have happened, the seaweed would have had to have overcome the station in a matter of minutes. How could that have happened, and why? It was no secret to the Marines that the northeast section of the facility was also where the nuclear reactors were located, nor that their path suddenly became clear once they took the metal stairs up to the access corridor, which turned west towards the central command bridge, while the jungle of rotting seaweed clogged the corridors leading east towards the nuclear reactors. Though all of the Marines made the unspoken correlation between the path that the seaweed took and the location of the nuclear reactors, the Marines said nothing. Theirs was not to reason why, theirs was to do the latter part, and irradiated seaweed had nothing to do with mission completion. The thick, gunmetal titanium doors to the command center had been sealed shut, and it took a while for the petite female Marine with the flame gun to cut through the 3 locking bars. Once the door slid open, the Marines found only one body in the massive circular-shaped command bridge. The body was slumped down in front of the main visual communication monitor. The head, left arm and upper torso looking to have been completely blown apart. An expended flare gun was still gripped in the hand of the right arm, which was still attached to what was left of the body. The main visual communication station was also a charred wreck due to the extremely close self-inflicted discharge of the flare gun, but fortunately the last message that the person had recorded was stored in the main memory drive located in a separate section of the command bridge. In fact, all of the kaleidoscope's memory files were located at the station. Once again, it was an easy matter to eject the 3 half-inch by 2-inch memory drives which contained all of the kaleidoscope's memory from the day she launched until the day Earth lost contact with her. Taking possession of the files, the raider platoon leader, a lieutenant named Gabriel, must have thought that this mission was a cakewalk until the UTGS Kosovo alerted the team of a massive, unidentified biological creature headed directly towards the kaleidoscope. Almost immediately, the entire facility was rocked suddenly with enough force to knock several Marines off their feet, even with their maglocks engaged. Whatever had hit the kaleidoscope was massive enough to make it list even more toward the ocean. The gunship pilot outside, a female warrant officer named Nasri, transmitted a panicked warning to the Marines to hurry up, as a monstrous, tentacled thing was pulling itself out of the ocean and was crawling up onto the facility. As the Marines exited the main superstructure and made their way outside on the landing deck, they were confronted with a prehistoric-looking aquatic horror of horrendous size. It resembled an animal from Earth's Ordovician period from over 400 million years ago, a sickly pale, greenish-orange, squid-like animal which had a conical shell, much like a hermit crab. However, this beast was well over 200 feet long and had a tangle of greedy, groping tentacles over 50 feet long extending from around a maw, surrounded by hooked feelers and a large beak. But this wasn't what had shocked the Marines, nor the fact that the beast's multitude of eyes, each roughly 10 feet in diameter, were glassy and appeared dead, or the fact that the creature smelled of rot and decay and showed signs of advanced decomposition. No. What startled the Marines was that what was supposed to be the creature's head, just above the milky pale and glassy dead eyes, was a giant hole, out of which protruded a 10-foot thick branch of seaweed which gave off a pallid, sickly yellow glow. The beast moved sluggishly, like a puppet being manipulated by strings, as it clambered aboard the kaleidoscope, cutting off the path between the Marines and their awaiting gunship. The beast's hungry tentacles grasped and flailed clumsily around, looking for something to feed into its grotesque beak, and immediately snatched up Lieutenant Gabriel and several other Marines, the fire from their rifles having absolutely no effect on the aquatic nightmare. That was when the plucky little female Marine flame gunner, who would one day become famous throughout the galaxy for saving her platoon multiple times from the clutches of certain doom, while simultaneously losing her flame gun, sprang into action. Opening the aperture to her flame gun to its widest setting, she fired upon the beast with a filled charge from her weapon's capacitor at the point where the glowing seaweed entered the brain cavity of the Leviathan which was attacking them. The beast reared up its head, tentacles outstretched, and dropping the Marines unceremoniously before it slammed forcefully down on the armored deck. The resulting impact shook the entire facility and knocked the young Marine off her feet. Her flame gun fell from her hands and, cursing bitterly at how much it would cost her to replace yet another flame gun, the young Marine watched dejectedly as the weapon tumbled down the deck and disappeared over the side and into the ocean. The giant stinking beast, who now seemed officially dead, lay motionless on the deck, its sheer weight slowly dragging it back down below the waves. The seaweed, which only moments ago was glowing, now resembled a dead, mottled green-grey tangle of vegetation which the Marines were slogging through earlier. As the beast sank below the waves, it left behind thick, gelatinous pools of glowing, yellowish-green liquid that poured out of its open wound. This substance emitted radiation, though at a level which was not immediately harmful to humans. The Marines carefully scooped the slightly glowing, yellowish-green ooze into a composite plastic container that they found, as their radiation-proof containers had been previously damaged. now safely aboard their Helios gunship, the Marine raiders brought back the sample to the UTGS Kosovo, where it was secured inside the small hydroponics facility that was shielded against radiation. The Kaleidoscope's data files were sent to UTG Fleet Headquarters on Mars, Priority 1 messages no longer having to take months to reach the home system after the discovery of the circular wormhole which, unfortunately, had trapped and killed Chancellor Abode 200 years ago. Since then, messages from deep space could be transmitted into the circular wormhole, which could then be beamed out through the Neptune relay station and carried directly to UTG Fleet Headquarters. The entire process only took a few hours, and, thanks to advancements in technology, the sending station did not have to suffer the consequences of massive system shutdowns or the need to survive on minimal life support, like the UTGS Florensky had to endure hundreds of years earlier. The UTGS Kosovo remained on station over Hyboria Major for the next 36 hours, awaiting orders from UTG Fleet Command after they had reviewed the files taken from the Kaleidoscope. During this time, Marine Lieutenant Gabriel demanded to know why it took the Kosovo so long to alert his team that the presence of a living biological creature so large was approaching. Their answer was simple. The beast wasn't alive. 36 hours later, the UTGS Kosovo received a Priority 1 message from UTG Fleet Command, ordering her to sanitize the area, then return to the home system with all haste. Targeting the wreckage of the Kaleidoscope, the Kosovo struck the facility with 2 volleys from her plasma gun in low orbit, which was more than enough to send the Kaleidoscope to the bottom of the ocean. That done, the Kosovo warped into hyperspace for the journey back to Earth. 3 weeks later, the UTG Kosovo dropped out of warp in the area of Neptune's orbit and was on the deceleration trajectory towards the massive orbital station that was the San Diego Naval Fleet Base in orbit over Earth, when she received a priority message from the UTG Fleet Command on Mars with immediate orders to divert course to Saturn. Troubling new discovery, one which worried corporate executives, would be the only reason why the UTGS Kosovo and her precious cargo would be diverted. UTG Fleet Command, Mars Planetary Authority, Terran Year 2587. After the United Terran government gained control over all of mankind, it was necessary to add additional branches of government so as to maintain order and control over mankind's growing expansion into space. To the already existing executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch were added the branch of the Propaganda Ministry and the Ministry of Equitable Distribution, which was charged with ensuring that the 99% were allotted a fair share of the galactic bounty which the 1% deemed they deserved. All of these branches were equal, more or less, but all answered to the branch of supreme authority, the most powerful of all branches of government, whose dictates had the authority to override any decisions passed by any of the lower branches of government. This branch of supreme authority was made up of a secretive board of 12 executives whose identity was hidden from the public record, but who literally had the power of life and death over the entire galaxy. They were, in essence, as enigmatic as the god whom the ancient Earth cults had worshipped centuries ago, and may well have been considered gods themselves. Their status was so far above the elite 1% that they were considered the 0.1% of the 1%. Though the branch of supreme authority was located within the Asian Continental Authority on Earth, there were a few top-secret and highly secured locations across colonized space where the Supreme Authority could meet, the second largest of such meeting places being in the capital city dome of the Mars Planetary Authority. It was here where the Supreme Authority met, in the Capitol Rotunda building, several stories high and looking down upon the Mars Capital District. Outside of the Supreme Authority meeting room was a full battalion of the elite, black-uniformed SS or Secret Service, with orders to kill on sight any unauthorized person on that floor. On the streets below, manning roadblocks for 1 mile surrounding the meeting place, was an entire regiment of the highly armed Internal Regulatory Service, the dreaded IRS. They were the government's personal brown uniformed armed forces, and they were equal in number to the Terran government's regular military. The politicians never really trusted the loyalties of the regular military, especially the Space Marines, who still held on to ancient traditions such as honor and integrity, which the Terran government found somewhat distasteful. The defeat of the UTG military at Alpha Centauri against the remarkably well-trained, well-equipped and highly motivated colonies of New Columbia left a bitter taste in the Supreme Authority's mouth, which lasted to this day. The meeting place was a grand, opulently decorated, semicircular room whose walls were lined with pure gold. On a large, semicircular dais, the seats of the Supreme Authority were arranged in 2 tiers. 5 chairs were on the upper tier for the Terran Corporation executives, and 7 chairs on the lower tier for the Terran government leaders. On the wall behind them was a large, ancient bronze plaque on which mankind's 3 commandments were engraved. For the citizenry, give all for the government. For the government, give all for the corporations. For the corporations, give some for the citizenry whom the government deems worthy. They sat facing a large holographic projection of the data files which were recovered from the kaleidoscope. A very panicked man wearing a white lab coat was emotionally explaining the events which had occurred in the last hours, events which brought an end to the kaleidoscope's mission to Hyboria Prime. All around him, the facility looked as if it was being shaken, as if caught in the middle of a seaquake, and the sickening sound of bending metal was so loud that he had to yell to be heard above it. The man in the lab coat, apparently the last survivor of the over 3,000 crew and complement of the station, started by recalling that the submarine, the Deep Dive 6, which they sent to the seafloor to gather the seaweed, had encountered a biological specimen of gigantic proportions. Resembling an ancient Earth mosasaur, the creature was at least 250 feet long and covered in a segmented exoskeleton from the crown of its alligator-like head to its flat vertical tail. 2 flippers, each extending 50 feet from the body, protruded just behind the Leviathan's 70-foot-long and narrow maw. Immediately, the crew of the deep dive engaged the system which sent a 50,000 volt of electricity out into the water. The maneuver worked well as the Leviathan immediately spun around and sped in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, the creature's massive tail slammed into the submarine amidships, battering the hull and sending it crashing into the endless bed of seaweed. Her hull now breached, the nuclear reactor spilled radioactive material over the ocean floor. Despite the dangers, a dozen 3-crew submersibles were sent down to the wreckage, only to find to their horror that the seaweed had somehow come alive, glowing from the radioactive spill, and wrapped all of the submersibles within its vines. Horror crept upon horror as the crews of the trapped submersibles saw the crew of the downed submarine, obviously dead but animated. The tops of their skulls had been torn away and a vine of seaweed protruding out of the brain cavity. The crews of the submersibles, which numbered over 30 in total, had only a few moments to contemplate the alarming circumstances they found themselves in before the vines of seaweed tore their little submersibles apart and burrowed into their skulls. Likewise, the giant sea creatures swimming near the seaweed bed were also being ensnared by the clinging vines, their skulls mercilessly being broken open as vines slithered into the now open cavity. The glowing vines reached upwards at a rapid pace, wrapping and entangling itself around subsurface structures of the facility before climbing up the northeastern section of the kaleidoscope and headed towards the nuclear reactors. So fast was the infestation that no one could escape the reach of the seaweed, the vines creeping through the ventilation shafts to get to the people sealing themselves in their rooms or workspaces. And once the vine was burrowed into the now dead crew members, the reanimated corpses would walk towards the edge of the facility on shambling legs to fall overboard into the waiting ocean. The last survivor was the chief scientist who had first discovered the seaweed and who thought it could be processed into human feed. As his video feed showed hundreds of the deceased crew now creeping towards the edge of the facility, a vine of seaweed protruding from their skulls, he initiated the shutdown of the nuclear reactors, recorded his last message on the data files, then put the flare gun into his mouth and pulled the trigger. Though the events which the man described were terrifyingly horrific, The 12 seated at the dais watched with a sense bordering on boredom. To be honest, there existed literally thousands of transmissions and data files containing the last words of colonizing space explorers just moments before some tragedy befell them, and there were likely thousands more scattered throughout the far reaches of space, which had yet to be discovered. Still, the slightly glowing yellowish ooze which the Marines had collected greatly interested the 12 members of the Supreme Authority, which is why this rare assembly of the Supreme Authority had been convened. It was a byproduct of the irradiated seaweed which could control the mind and the action of a massive sea creature. If that substance could somehow be synthesized into something odorless and tasteless, the Terran Supreme Authority would have complete control of the entire galaxy without fear of a free-thinking civilization like those of the constitutional republics. In fact, if the Terran Supreme Authority could somehow sabotage the water supplies of New Columbia, the rogue colonies of Alpha Centauri could be brought back under control of the United Terran government. It was imperative that the sample be brought to Earth immediately and, of course, sealed safely away in an area free of radiation. Saturn orbit, Terran Year 2587. For many years after the ceasefire, the UTG had been utilizing specialized mining vessels known as ice harvesters to collect ice from the outer rings of Saturn for transportation back to Earth, the Moon, and Mars. Long before the facilities were built into the ice harvesting vessels, the ice collected from space had to be brought either to Earth or Mars to be melted down, filtered, sanitized, and purified as water for the ever-growing population of mankind's two homeworlds. The massive 2,500-foot-long ice harvester UTGS Messica, whose hull resembled that of a corn on the cob due to the many 100-foot-wide, dome-shaped freezer bays which festooned the ship, was 2 days away from completing its 3-month mission of ice harvesting, and its exhausted but very well-paid crew of 75 were preparing to return to the Norfolk Port Authority station, which was in orbit around Earth. There they would spend the next month and a half downloading the ice into smaller shuttles for transportation planetside. Norfolk Station was a 2-square-mile orbital station, half of which was dedicated to docking and port operations, and the other half dedicated to the vices and sins of the flesh, designed to part the weary ship crews from their well-earned pay. 38 hours before the UTGS Messica's scheduled jump into hyperspace, her collision alarms began ringing. An enormous chunk of ice, over half the size of the ice harvester itself, was hurtling on a collision course with the ship. Fortunately, the early warning alarms gave the Messica nearly a day to change course, but that was not what caused alarm to the Messica's captain. The ice crystals which form the rings of Saturn range from a few millimeters to a few meters. The size of this chunk of ice, with a mass of over 1.5 kilometers wide, was an anomaly that bordered on impossible. Being the inquisitive type, the captain of the UTGS Messica, Captain Edgar Pintalu, ordered a change of course and recalculated the jump point, but brought the ship near enough to the ice anomaly to use the ship's limited planetary scanners to study and perhaps mark it for future examination. It was 18 hours to jump when Captain Pintalu suddenly called a complete stop of the inertial propulsion warp engines, the telemetry data of the massive space iceberg leaving him in complete shock. On the surface of that gargantuan ice block hurtling through space were signs of carbon, evidence of life. Moreover, there was confirmation of a huge solid metallic structure encased within the ice. Immediately, Pintalu relayed UTG Fleet Command on Mars of the finding, and he was, in turn, ordered to mark the anomaly and follow it closely until a military patrol frigate could arrive on station. This delayed the Messica's jump into hyperspace by 10 days, but Pintalu dutifully obeyed his orders. These days, all UT ships' captains had over a century of strict obedience to Globo Corporation and government dictates ingrained into their DNA. When the naval fleet heavy frigate UTGS Kosovo arrived, Captain Pintalu eagerly handed over all of the limited data telemetry on the Spaceberg, which the Messica was able to collect. Finally, the ice harvester was allowed to jump into hyperspace, headed towards the pleasure centers of Norfolk Station. And it wasn't a moment too soon. A slight radiation leak had been discovered in the hydroponics facility 2 weeks earlier. Pentalu had planned to have it serviced once they reached Norfolk Station, but had to have that entire section sealed off during the wait for the naval frigate to arrive. Before the jump to hyperspace, however, the captain of the Kosovo transferred possession of a thick, transparent, double-walled composite plastic container roughly 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 3 feet high, to Captain Pentalu. It was filled with a slimy, fungus-looking substance which emitted a slight yellowish glow. Seemingly relieved to be rid of the substance, the captain of the Kosovo ordered Captain Pentalu to secretly store the container in the Messica's hydroponics facility under armed guard until they reached Norfolk Station, where a military security team would be waiting to take possession of the cargo. When Pentalu inquired of the naval fleet captain why the mysterious glowing substance was not being transferred in a radiation-proof container, the fleet captain replied that the radiation-proof containers had been damaged and were unusable, but that the double-walled, composite plastic containers were just as good, if not better, so long as the cargo was secured in a hydroponics area. Captain Pentalu obeyed his instructions without question, neglecting to mention the small, almost negligible radiation leak in hydroponics. The jump from Saturn's rings to Earth orbit was usually a 16-hour journey. It would ultimately take the UTGS Messica 6 months to reach its destination. Meanwhile, reconnaissance probes from the UTGS Kosovo were sent to the massive spaceberg and fired tungsten steel cable anchors into it. Once tethered, the examination of the giant anomaly could begin. Dozens of metallic, egg-shaped pods roughly 8 feet around and 16 feet long could be seen just under the surface of the ice. They were connected by some sort of thick tether, nearly half a kilometer long, to a giant cylindrical object over 600 feet long, colored in shades of red-violet and lavender, and highlighted in a bold white stripe which surrounded the four-quarter deck. On this bold white stripe, written in thick black letters 25 feet high, were the words UTGS, Jakarta City. She was in remarkably well-preserved condition since her disappearance nearly 500 years ago. It took 10 hours for the Kosovo's plasma beam on low power to bore a hole through the ice to the Jakarta City wide enough to allow a squad of marine raiders wearing their bulky ship-to-ship life sustainment suits to enter. The spacewalk from the Kosovo to the ice formation, which encased the Jakarta City, was extremely risky, but the well-trained marine raiders accomplished the task, including the claustrophobic trek down the narrow ice tunnel which led to the mysterious ghost ship. The Marines would have to hurry, though, as the ice tunnel would freeze over again in a matter of hours, trapping them inside to suffer the same fate as the crew. Using a plasma rifle, the Marine Raider team, again led by Lieutenant Gabriel, penetrated into the interior of the ancient colonizer ship. It was a cramped, claustrophobia-inducing experience, as much of the interior space was blocked by ice, and in many places, the young female Marine corporal operating a newly issued plasma rifle had to run down several charge capacitors of her own weapon to melt a path through the corridors and P-ways as they struggled forwards to the command deck. Along the way, the Marines discovered the mummified frozen bodies of several of the passengers and crew, all very well preserved, all wearing environmental life support suits, and all huddled together as if waiting for their inevitable fate. It was a heart-wrenching sight for the Marines, but soon they'd burned their way to the command bridge. With the aperture of the plasma rifle set to full open, and with the last charge capacitor set to its lowest setting, the young female Marine carefully and patiently thawed out the drives which held the Jakarta City's data files. Carefully removing those files from their mountings, the Marines beat a hasty retreat from the frozen tomb and returned to the UTGS Kosovo, where Lieutenant Gabriel turned the files over to the naval ship captain. Like the corpses aboard the Jakarta City, her data files were also remarkably well preserved, and the heartbreaking tale of the fate of the Jakarta City was soon uncovered. The Jakarta City's navigational system was linked to her explorer ship, the UTGS Carbon. However, when the Carbon inexplicably fell out of hyperspace at the Jupiter jump point, the Jakarta City's navigational link was severed, thus flinging the Jakarta City unguided towards the second hyperspace jump point near Saturn. This unanticipated and violent action damaged the ship's hyperdrive generators, and she tumbled uncontrolled through her inertial flight trajectory until, days later, she finally ended up drifting lifelessly somewhere within Saturn's rings. Using what was left of their warp power, the Jakarta City was able to limp slowly to the edge of Saturn's rings in the hopes of issuing a Mayday alert to the many passing explorer and colonizer vessels who were leaving the solar system and using Saturn's gravitational pull as a slingshot. Alas, the damaged and overstrained warp engines finally died just as the Jakarta City neared the periphery of Saturn's rings, and although there were at least a dozen starships in the area, her damaged communications array could only send out weak signals, which all went unheeded. While the Jakarta City was slowly pulled back into Saturn's rings, all of the power she had left was switched to life support, but that would only last a few days. Meanwhile, ice from Saturn's rings began slowly forming around the ship. As the end drew near, and the ship temperature rapidly dropped to fatal conditions, family groups were allowed to climb into the ship's inspection and repair pods, small vessels tethered to the ship which were used to inspect the outer hull and make repairs to the ship. These pods came equipped with their own internal life support systems and allowed the family groups to spend a few more hours together before the systems ran out of power and the families succumbed together to the frozen void of space. Rather than tow the Jakarta City back to Earth to bury the families on their birth planet, a costly endeavor to say the least, what with the expenditure of assets on such a large recovery mission, plus the inevitable lawsuits and legal fees from hundreds, if not thousands, of enraged family members who would, no doubt, be demanding answers to uncomfortable questions which the Globo corporations would rather not be asked. The United Terran government, instead, found a clever solution to the problem. A nondescript space freighter was assigned to ferry 4 warp drive engines to the location of the Jakarta City, where the warp engines would then be secured to 4 points around the spaceberg. In addition, several telemetry scramblers would be embedded into the ice, effectively making the spaceberg invisible to scanners, unless the spaceberg was actually in visual range of anything. The chances of that happening were as astronomical as a giant meteorite hitting the moon's Slorensky crater dead center. Once the warp engines were secured, they would light off in a sequence that would point the Jakarta City in the direction of the sun. Once the correct vector had been set, all 4 warp engines would ignite in one burst, which would cause all 4 to break away from the spaceberg and send the Jakarta City on a trajectory which, after a few years, would eventually send her directly into the heart of the sun. No one would be any wiser, and a long-forgotten potential financial disaster for the global corporations would remain long forgotten. Between Mars and Jupiter orbit, Terran Year 2587. 9 hours into the UTGS Messica's 16-hour journey to Norfolk Station, her alarms were ringing across the ship. Somehow, for reasons unknown to Captain Pintalu, the mysterious glowing ooze somehow gained some type of sentience. It escaped the Messica's hydroponics facility and forcefully entered the security guards' bodies via their nose, ears, and mouth. Responding to the primary instinct to replicate itself, the corpses of the now deceased guards attacked the other crew members, holding them down with almost superhuman strength, while the ooze poured out of their mouths and eyes. The ooze then forcefully entered the other crew members, and the whole horrifying process spread rapidly throughout the ship. Fearing that this infection would be brought to Earth, or worse, somehow contaminate the ice which would eventually be turned into drinking water, Captain Pintalu brought his ship out of hyperspace to drift forever as a ghost ship in the void between Mars and Earth. Between Mars and Earth orbit, Terran Year 2588. It was a 1 in a billion trillion occurrence. An impossibility, something which only the hand of God could have orchestrated. When the UTGS Messica dropped out of hyperspace, she appeared in the flight trajectory path of the massive spaceberg which encased the unfortunate UTGS Jakarta City. The contact was brief, but forceful enough to slightly divert the trajectory of both objects. The spaceberg's trajectory no longer sent it towards the sun, while the inertial trajectory of the UTGS Messica was disturbed enough that it would eventually pass near Earth. A few moments later, Earth's planetary alarms were sounding, warning that an unknown metallic object was drifting into established space lanes and potentially threatening the hundreds of starships which use those lanes every day. The orbital station's long-range scanners confirmed that the drifting vessel was a Saturn ice harvester and attempted to identify her. The mysterious ship drifting aimlessly through space was indeed identified as the UTGS Messica, which had missed its arrival date to Norfolk Station by 6 months. As the United Terran government was extremely interested in the ice harvester for some unknown reason, 2 starship tug vessels were immediately dispatched from Norfolk Station to retrieve the Messica and tow her back to one of the docks used only by the military. Simultaneously, a squad of Naval Fleet security personnel were dispatched to the bay where the Messica was docked to retrieve its top-secret cargo. At that exact same moment, the mysterious spaceberg, almost a kilometer in diameter, smashed dead center directly into the Florensky crater on the moon, completely obliterating the helpless Florensky shipbuilding yards. To this day, no one knows how that huge chunk of space ice got through all of the Earth's sensors and scanners and remained undetected until it was too late. With no one but itself to blame for this unprecedented calamity, but unwilling to accept responsibility for the catastrophe, the UTG was forced to shift the blame for the complete destruction of the Florensky shipbuilding yards and the deaths of 250,000 citizens as an act of God. Such a term had not been used for half a millennia, and the UTG Galactic Propaganda Ministry had a difficult time explaining the concept of God to the billions of enlightened citizens scattered across the cosmos when the news of the destruction of the galaxy's largest shipyards became public. In fact, the concept of God, much less an act of God, had become so foreign that the Terran government simply explained that God was a mythical deity worshipped by those savage constitutional republicans of New Columbia. Meanwhile, as the Messica was carefully being guided into the docking bay of the city-sized orbital station, and the restraining tethers were secured to the ice harvester, 20 military fleet security personnel breached the entrance hatch to the ship. As they filed into the interior of the ship, they found it illuminated by an unnatural, sickly yellow glow. 36 hours later, all contact with the Norfolk orbital station was lost. End transmission. Copyright 500 Years of Space Exploration. Historical Module Lesson 1. New Columbia Board of Education. New Columbia Year 1776. Well, my sincere thanks to the ever-wonderful Taxi Dancer for that incredible space sci-fi horror everything kind of tale. All right, yeah, and all that talk of corporations and seeking out profit sounds a bit too likely to happen, to be honest, if you ask me. So yeah, wonderful tale there. Quite a mouthful, some of those sentences for me to get through, but I'm glad I did it. It's one of those that's been sitting on my desktop for way too long, waiting for me to read it, but I'm glad I finally did it. Well, I'm exhausted. That's enough for one evening, definitely. But I will, of course, be back again very soon. So, till the next time, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.